Hey, y'all. I hope everybody's doing great today. I just got back a week ago from a 7-day archery elk hunt in Colorado. It was my first Western hunt. I did not go with a guide, and it was a major learning experience for me. I wanted to do a debrief on this, and I thought the best way to do that would be to have someone really knowledgeable in this area interview me for your purposes. Cliff Gray is a guy who is an expert in this field. He is a former longtime guide and owner of a guide service in Colorado. He's been on the Joe Rogan show. He has a very successful YouTube channel, Pursuit with Cliff, and he's also on Instagram and has a private membership group. I thought having Cliff interview me would bring out a lot of information that would be helpful to you. And at the end of the day, that's really what this is about, is for me sharing my journey. And so hopefully the mistakes that I make, the things that I learn can be of benefit to you. And Cliff is a guy who's constantly getting messages on Instagram, email, through his membership groups, asking him to create content about all these different things. He spends a lot of time focusing on DIY hunting out west and helping people prepare for that who have not got a lot of experience in it. And so it was a great conversation. And I think at the end, it really ended up being a really good way to do this debrief. I hope you enjoy the conversation with Cliff, and I hope you take something out of this, that if you're doing an archery elk hunt or even any kind of elk hunt this fall. If you enjoy this, please subscribe to my channel. I am on Apple Podcasts. I am on Spotify, both audio and video. It's also on YouTube and Rumble. So hopefully this brings you some good information. Enjoy it. Thanks so much for listening.
All right, Eric. So just got back from 7 days out there, all alone, right? Elk hunting.
Pretty close to being alone. I had some buddies out there. They were hunting separately. And then I had a camera guy with me, actually, because we were doing some filming for this ruckless venture that we've got going. So we're actually creating a film off of it, kind of a first time guy out there going through the whole experience thing. So I had a camera guy with me the whole time.
Oh, okay, awesome. Well, it'll be cool to see that when it comes out. But for the same reason that this discussion I think will be very interesting for people, Eric. Like it's hard. We briefly talked about it before you getting on here and me hitting record, and it's hard for people to really get a feel for what's involved in these elk hunts, like particularly your first one on public land, easy to draw tag sort of thing. It's hard to actually get a grip on what it's like out there, and how, the difficulties and the things that you run into that, I try to talk about them on my YouTube, but it's always abstracted because I'm not like
Right.
in the moment. And also a lot of what I talk about, man, it's from like an observer standpoint. Like it's from being somebody's guide or, taking guys into drop camps. So there's even that distance to it. So I think it'll be super helpful to hear your experience. Also because it's fresh, man. Like you got back 3 or 4 days ago.
Well, yeah, I worked so I've got a client out there in Colorado. So I got done on Sunday night was my last hunt, and I just got back, and I was on a red eye Wednesday night, so I literally just got back in town yesterday morning. So
Yeah.
it's pretty fresh, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Well, what's the give us the overview, man? Like I mean, is there any big takeaways right off the bat that you would say about it?
Yeah, so I'd say probably the most challenging thing for me, and I'm an organization guy, so just trying to tackle all of the stuff ahead of time. I was always second guessing everything from the beginning, right? Am I overpacking? Am I underpacking? Luckily, I had some resources, some friends who live out there who could give me a little bit of guidance. But at the end of the day, you're still trying to do it all yourself. And when I originally was thinking about doing this, I applied in New Mexico. I applied in a couple other states that were, random draws, and I had guides lined up for those states. And so Colorado was kind of my fallback. I didn't draw in any of those places. And so then when I originally planned Colorado, I've got a buddy who was kind of like, hey, there's an area that I know fairly well. Come up here and, I'll go out with you for the first few days. Well, so let me circle back. A friend of mine in Montana originally said, let's go there. I'll meet you there and I'll hunt with you for a week. And I was like, all right, great. And then he pulled a Nevada elk tag on the second go around, and he was like, "Hey man, I'm gonna go to Nevada." I was like, "Okay." So then I got another buddy who lives, in that about 3 hours from there, and he's like, "Hey, I'll meet you up there, and I'll go out with you for a few days, but I'm gonna chase mule deer a lot of the time." And he's like, "But at least I'll kind of give you a soft entry." I'm like, "All right, that sounds good."
Sure.
And then he says, "Hey, I got this huge buck on camera. Like I'm going to be chasing him the whole time." So at the end of the day, I went out there, but it was me taking it on completely on my own and with no knowledge other than, what I could try to glean from people ahead of time. So yeah.
Yeah. And you know what's funny about this, Eric, is like, I think when I hear the story, I think like you might think that this is kind of unique.
It's probably normal.
It's like always the story, man. Because everybody's got. I think we're all guilty of it when it's in the off season, and we got a buddy who wants to go. Who's like maybe new to this type of hunting or whatever. We want to
Right.
go with them. We want to help them. So people tend to maybe like overcommit's probably not the word, but they say like, "Oh yeah, I'll help you," or "I'll go with you," and then as they do their own hunt planning, things change. It's
Right.
like it's totally the norm. I can't tell you how many. Like I personally think that most guys that you run into in the Colorado mountains who are by themselves elk hunting, that wasn't the plan. You know what I mean? I know that you
Right.
ended up. I know that you ended up with you had your camera guy and that sort of thing. But a lot of the solo guys you run into, it's like, why are you solo hunting? They're like, because everybody who said they're gonna go with me didn't go.
Right.
So it's pretty normal, man. I think it's good. I think it's like a good piece of advice in general. Is like, if you when you're planning,
Be
just
prepared.
really
Be prepared for it to be you.
Yeah, exactly. Be prepared for it might just be you going.
Yeah. So that's kind of what happened. It ended up being me trying to figure it out. I will say, I know you mentioned this earlier, but I do think the stuff that you put out is super helpful. I can't imagine, and I know people did this, but I can't imagine somebody doing this, 20, 25 years ago when there were zero resources.
Right.
No online maps, nobody talking about it on YouTube, nobody kind of saying, "Hey, be prepared for this or be prepared for that." I mean, I think the fact that stuff is all out there, even though I felt super underprepared, there weren't a lot of things when I got out there that was like, "Oh, I don't really know what to do here. I don't really know what to try."
Sure.
Right? I know there's a million things I did wrong, but at least I had ideas of what I should try next, or making sure I had, this specific kind of gear or these specific kind of things to be ready. So there was never a point out there where I felt underprepared, at least in terms of, gear or physical preparation, those kinds of things. It was really more about the hunting part of it and just understanding how to best approach things strategically when certain things didn't happen that you thought were going to happen.
Right. But you had a lot of you'd done so much research that run into situations and you'd be like, "Oh yeah, I kind of remember Cliff talking about this or somebody else talking about this." Like I get that being helpful. One question I have for you, Eric, that's more just like I guess like feedback for me is I try not to be negative. I walk this line of trying to be positive about this type of elk hunting, and
Mm-hmm.
I mean it's a crazy awesome experience. I don't we'll get into it, but for some guys it's like life changing, right? These type of experiences. So I think there's a huge positive element to it, but I try to be realistic in my content with people, but I always feel like I'm bordering on being negative. Like basically, trying like almost lowering people's expectations. And I hope I don't do that, but I'm just kind of curious if you have any thoughts on that. Did you
No, I
is
think
that
it's actually good, really good the way you do it. I mean, I know this is probably going to sound weird, but there were times throughout the course of the hunt where your voice was in my head. Day 6 was a really good one. Like day 6, I was super frustrated. It was like, what the hell am I doing out here? It was just to kind of give a little backdrop to it. They were not talking at all. I mean, it
yeah.
was dead silent. And I had worked a lot on calling for the entire year before I went out there. So I felt fairly confident in my ability to, different kinds of calls and this and that. And I ran into enough people, or I talked to enough people, whether it was through instant message or through Instagram while I was out there in different parts of the state that were all saying the same thing. They were just like, it's like completely silent. I heard
Right.
one bugle in 7 days, and it was at about 3 a.m. And that was it. I had one encounter the second day I was out there, but they just weren't talking. And I think for me, that was probably something like I was prepared mentally for a lot of different things. I was prepared to screw up over and over, but I wasn't mentally prepared for it to just be silent for an entire week and have like almost zero interaction or engagement, not be able to. The area I was in was pretty heavily timbered, so there weren't many places where you could actually glass from. And I took, I think, two or three different evenings, and then one morning, or maybe it was 2 evenings, one morning, where I like said, okay, I'm just going to glass from this one location where you could glass from in that area, and there was zero, like nothing.
Yeah.
So that was probably the thing I wasn't ready for, was for it to just be dead for a week.
Right. How did you? And so that again, Eric, is not uncommon in a lot of these Colorado units.
Yeah.
You probably pick that up when you're there. Like you can
pick that one up.
Yeah. Yeah. You could go a long time without any vocalizations. And the thing is like, I guess just a thought on that, because you brought it up. It sounds like you were very like you probably were up to speed on the different sounds. You felt confident in the sounds and that sort of thing. And you know this, but I think some people don't, because you were just out there. But man, a lot of times, like, people will blame their calling on the fact that they're not hearing vocalizations, and that 99.99999% of the time is not the case. When elk are vocalizing, a lot of times, like, it really doesn't matter what sound you make. Like I'll be rusty and I'll go into an area with high, elk density, and the first bugle I make in the morning will be like indistinguishable that it's an elk, or I'm attempting to be an elk, and a bull will bugle back. A lot of times people, I think, really way overestimate the need to be like perfect sounds to get vocalizations, and they get frustrated by it. But sometimes they're just not vocalizing, or you're not. I think it's sometimes they're just not vocalizing, and I think other times they're there, but they're so low density that they just don't vocalize very much.
Yeah, I think for me it was the second one. I had practiced a good bit, and I had actually gotten on with some people that are pretty successful elk hunters before I went out there, and just kind of ripped off some different sounds for them and just said, hey, can you critique my locator bugle? Can you critique this? Can you critique this cow sound? And so I felt pretty decent about my ability to make pretty decent calls. And so I wasn't in that, and I do know what you're talking about because I've heard people say that. I wasn't really in the self-questioning mode on the calling.
Right.
I think it was the second one. It wasn't a super high density area to begin with, and I knew that going in. And and I ran into a couple people that had hunted that unit for a long time, who were really open, nice guys, and they all basically said, they're pretty call shy around here until things really get hopping.
Right. Yep. No, I can totally get how people get frustrated by that. What do you think that? Why do you think that is, Eric? Do you think it's just because there's so much like media about elk calling, so it's like you kind of in your mind you thought it was going to be a bigger part of the hunt?
Yeah, I think honestly, I think that there's just so much content created around calling, and vocalization, and I think probably obviously every time. Every time you go out on a hunt, you learn something, right? So for me, the thing that I came out of this knowing that, okay, the next time I go do this, I'm going to have to be a lot better at, is having completely different strategies around, a quiet unit, and also unit selection, right? So if I had thought a lot more about that going in, I probably would have, and looking at that unit gone, okay, there's not very many places to glass from here. And so if I end up in a unit where there's no vocalization and there's not much glassing area, then, what's my next? Where do I go next? Or do I make sure that where I go does have a decent amount of glassing areas so that I've got a better fallback if they're not vocalizing?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good takeaway, man. Like, and I get this question all the time. I mean, you follow my stuff, so you know this, and
Yeah.
I struggle to answer it. I struggle to answer the question of, hey, how do I narrow down units? And a lot of times it's in the context of Colorado because up until things are changing a little bit, but for the most part, that's where people have a lot of options, right?
Right.
Like they can, there's like 20 units they can go hunt potentially. So how do I narrow it down? And it's really difficult. It's really difficult if you don't have some leads like you did. You had some buddies, get some just context to each individual unit. It's just hard to narrow it down. But one way or one thing to focus on is exactly what you're talking about. Figure out how you want to hunt, and then do your first cut on the units based on that. It seems like a little bit counterintuitive, I think, to people, but it's a good start.
I think it's also hard when you haven't done it before, like, because I did hear that from a number of people, and I heard that in a lot of your content is like, figure out what kind of hunt you want. But if you haven't gone and done it before, you don't really know what kind of hunt you want, right? I'm an East Coast guy who hunts from trees. And so when you're sitting there thinking about that much expanse and the idea of covering that much ground, it's such a different hunting concept that until you've done it, I think it's hard to know what kind of hunt you want, right?
Yeah.
That's a hard one to answer. So, I mean, I would just pose a question back to you, right? If you get out to a unit, because this is pretty typical, especially right now, if you get out to a unit, they're not vocalizing, you don't have a lot of glassing locations, it's a high timber unit, what is a good strategy from there, right? Other than just covering ground, which I did cover a ton of ground, but what do you tell somebody if there's not vocalization going on and they really don't have any places to glass from? Like, what's the best strategy at that point?
Yeah, and if you don't have prior knowledge of the area, it's tricky. I mean, because what it is I think that people run into this dynamic, and I've run into it in the dynamic of going to places like Alaska or something. People will come to Colorado, and they come in with the mindset that the game populations are a lot denser than they are. Like, you probably noticed that just in general, Eric. Like, the habitat in Colorado, like, there's less game per mile than what most people are used to on the East or Midwest.
Yeah,
or like Texas or something. Like, it's
I
drastically
didn't realize that,
less.
but you're right. Like, after talking to people and after experiencing it, you're right. It's much, much thinner than I expected it to be.
Yeah, and it's like the same deal. When I go to Alaska, like, in my mind, I'm thinking like, oh, there's gonna be moose everywhere. It's like, dude, there's one moose every 10 square miles. You know what I mean? And,
Right.
then you go to the Yukon, it's even worse. You know what I mean? So, or I shouldn't say worse. It's just different. So you have like the density of game is really really dispersed. And so in the type of situation you're in, and you don't have prior information to the unit, it to some extent it becomes like you're still hunting, but it becomes very much like a scouting mission, in the sense that if I was thrown into that situation, the first thing I would do, even if it was an area where there's a lot of water, like this first 10 days of September, I would get my Onyx out, and I would like anywhere that there's a spring marked, if there's like springs that are marked in the timber, if there's any water like that, I would basically start going to those spots and just seeing if I could find a wallow that had just like was fresh.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And by fresh, I mean like I could smell elk, water's dirty, that sort of thing. So that's what I would start doing that. And I'd go to other areas where I could potentially, pick up sign, just to kind of narrow it down. Like, okay, there's some elk in this little pocket, or whatever. The downside of that, Eric, is that it's just a function of that type of situation, but it's not very effective. Like, you could spend, in a lot of these units, you could spend 7 days just doing that. Like, I'm gonna go check this spring, and then you're gonna find, where you're eventually gonna find some water that the elk are using right now. And the thing the only magical part about it is that future years, when you go back into that spot, you'll know they'll use the same spots. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I found on a ridge line, I found two wallows that were fairly close to each other, but they weren't fresh, right? And I went back and checked them 3 different occasions, and they hadn't been hit. And so, because I was sitting there thinking, well, maybe I should sit this wallow, but then because they hadn't been hit, there was I sat it one time, one evening, and so there's always these thoughts in the back of your head after you get done, like, okay, should I have sat that wallow for 3 or 4 days in a row, just kind of with the taking the chance that at some point they were going to come in, knowing that it hadn't been hit recently, and so I didn't do that, but there's this question in my head, like, should I have done that?
But I mean, the question, like, Eric, like, what was the sign at the wallow? Like, how did you know it was an elk wallow?
So there was a lot of fresh tracks around there. It was it was coming right up out of the bottom of a drainage. They had a lot of really good bedding. There's
But you had fresh elk tracks.
Yeah, there was a seep down in the bottom of that it was a small drainage, and there was a seep down in it, and the wallow was kind of sitting right up next to a pine tree coming out of it, and there was fresh tracks around it. I mean, when I say fresh, like within the last 4 or 5 days. And so and there was elk droppings and stuff around there too, so you knew that was an area they were traveling through. There wasn't a ton of bedding, fresh bedding around there, which is another reason I was like, I know they're traveling through here, but I don't know that they're staying here. So I just didn't sit it a bunch. But that was a question I was asking myself, was like, should I, when you can't get into anything, do you play the odds and sit something like that day after day, kind of rolling the dice that they'll hit it at some point or not?
And there are guys. I mean, in the ideal world, like, it sounds like that would have been, like, in my mind, a question too, right? If I couldn't find anything fresher, when they're real fresh, like, they're literally be muddy water, they'll smell like intense, like elk.
Right.
You'll see
and
where and you'll see where the bulls have been laying down, because sometimes there's spots where elk are hitting the water, and then there's spots where bulls are going and, like, really wallowing in them, And it could have been either, but when those bulls have been laying down in somewhere, it's pretty clear, like, they reek, and they're pretty consistent, and those could be worth sitting. But a spot like you're talking about, if there's fairly fresh elk sign, if a guy's real patient and that kind of stuff, it might work. And the other thing is, I don't do it, Eric, and it's not just something that I'm not saying it's not I'm not saying it's not very effective. It just might not match, like, my personality. But there are people I know who cold call in situations like that. Like, they'll call once every 30 minutes, once every hour and a half, as they sit on spots like that. And, bulls will show up silently or whatever. I know guys that do that.
I tried that. So this is a kind of a secondary question to that. In the area that I had an encounter one morning, it was an area that had kind of an old logging road that went through the middle of it, and there was 2 big clear cuts on each side of it, where they had brought a ton of timber in, and then they were surrounded by wooded areas. One of them had a creek running about, I don't know, probably it went on an angle, but it ran about 20 to 30 yards inside the tree line, right? And so there was this area that was about probably 20 yards wide inside the first tree line, and then there was a deeper tree line behind it, and it was an elk highway. I mean, there was tracks everywhere. And so I was trying to figure out the best way to hunt it. There was a small area in the middle of that clear cut that was just a few pines that were left over, where I actually set up one night and one morning, and I did exactly what you said. I just, like, called, because it looked to me like they were feeding at night on private a little bit to the east of that area, and then they were traveling in there during the day to bed.
Yeah.
And so I tried to figure out a couple of different ways to set up on that travel route, and did some cold calling. And I heard stuff going on in the timber, but nothing ever came out to the calling. And then there was a couple, one time in that setup where I tried to move in there a little bit deeper, and I just didn't, nothing happened once I did that. So I was trying to figure out, it was obviously a travel route. It was obviously they were moving in and out of there, and I couldn't figure out how to hunt it when they weren't responding.
Yeah, I actually had a question recently that's, like, analogous to this, Eric. And so this dynamic, when they're betting on public, but they're feeding on private,
Mm-hmm.
they, like, usually these are like generational things that have been going on in
They've learned
spots.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, and so when they come into the public to bed, and this is really common. There's some spots in the flat tops we had the same situation where big ranching for wildlife ranches, they were hunted different seasons than ours, so they were like true sanctuaries during the hunting season. And
Yeah.
elk would be on it, like elk would be rutting in the middle of the day on the private, and then I knew they were bedding on the public. And a lot of times it just has to do with the vegetation and like just the history of like how these places are homesteaded. A
Right.
lot of the steeper timber, like the darker timber, the timber that elk like to bed in during, particularly when it's hot like this, it just happens to be on public. So you have this dynamic a lot.
That's exactly what this was like. This there were a lot of deep drainages in this area that
Yeah,
I was hunting, and they could travel from that private, get over there pretty quick, not have to cross, much open area, and then get into a drainage.
yeah. And they're looking for something to bed in that they want to bed in that's cool, probably has
Yep.
some water in it, and it's just not available in the private. The problem is the minute the way they're getting onto the public, where they're bedding in the public, it's all been like by trial and error. And so the unfortunate answer to your question is it's just crazy hard. It's
Because they
crazy hard.
figured out how to avoid people, because people have been trying to hunt them for
Yeah, usually
forever, so they know how to
you-
get in there that way.
exactly. Like usually the wind is shitty in those spots. Usually it's very hard to like ambush them. And a lot of times the way you can kill them in those situations, and it's not going to help in this particular situation, but I guess for people's thought process,
Yeah.
is you can catch them on like a stormy day, or you catch like the thing that I would always consider is I knew when they were going to start hunting the private. And so if you can catch, even during archery season, if you can catch them the day that the day that ranch starts hunting, or if you have a storm system that changes the prevailing winds or something, they'll still go into the same bedding spots, but like if they get pushed because somebody's hunting them, there's trucks all of a sudden on the ranch or whatever, they'll show up earlier, or they'll show up, whatever. Same deal with the wind. It changes their it doesn't change their pattern. Like they still want to get to the bedding area, but they're susceptible because they're coming at a different time. They're coming at, so it's not. I mean, that's not like a good answer. That's
Yeah.
like going to be really effective all the time. But that's how most elk in those situations get killed. It's because something makes them more susceptible than they typically are. Because man, those patterns are like they've been doing it for 10, 20 years, and they got a groove that they go in and out, and it makes it. And there's probably a confluence of variables that make it very hard to kill them in there, because the reality is bedding areas, man, if they start getting shot up in bedding areas, they move and they don't
Yeah.
come
Well,
back.
the reason I tried to cold call them from this little, there were two gaps in the timber along that pathway, where they would have, where there was that track and all that sign. And so this little kind of nest of small pines had some good shooting lanes out of it. It was only about 30 yards from those gaps.
Okay.
And so that's where I was trying to call from, to see if I could either get one of them to just kind of either in the travel route through the gap, or potentially just kind of getting curious maybe and coming out through the gap, but not coming all the way out, that I might get a shot. But there was one evening that I did it that I had one right there. I couldn't see him, but I could hear him. And so I had
You can
something.
just hear him moving.
Yeah, he was just moving a lot, and it was kind of up and down right inside that tree line. It just wouldn't come out. And like he played around with us for probably an hour and 15 minutes until we ran out of light. And so the next day was the day that I was like, all right, I'm going to see if I can try to go in there. And I went in really, really early and checked the wind. And like you said, it was swirling everywhere. Like there's no way I could have gone in there and got anything done, because it was just, it was like being in a vortex. It just changed every like 3 seconds.
Yeah, it's that situation is just a frustrating one. Like, I
It's like,
dealt with-
they're going through there, but you're like, I don't know how to freaking get them.
yeah. I mean, it's like, are you a duck hunter, Eric?
No. Mm-mm.
So the reason I bring it up is because like I noticed this when I was a teenager and stuff. I hunted ducks a lot. I worked on some duck clubs, and
Mm-hmm.
there's like these guys would have all these different duck blinds, right? Like on their duck club, and they'd have their consistent ones that were pretty good all the time.
Yeah.
But then if you woke up on a morning and there was like the wind had changed, like we always have a north wind, but it changed to a south wind. There's like this one duck blind that always sucked, but if you hunted it that day,
On a south wind,
you
you
were
can
gonna
kill.
crush it,
Yeah.
right? Like these situations, and again, it's not helpful to somebody who's just going on a 5, 6 day, 7 day hunt. But as an outfitter and guide, that's how I viewed these situations, right? I
Yeah.
viewed it as like that's a thing, it's there, but when it's right, I'm gonna hit it and kill one. But outside of that, it's almost like a tease. You know what I mean?
Well, I can see, now having done it, one of the things that I've heard kind of repeatedly from different people is you're better off to go back to have a unit that's an okay unit, but to go in there year after year and really get to know the unit
Yeah.
than to count on, landing some primo unit and showing up in there once and thinking you're going to, kill this huge bull. I mean, the amount of knowledge that I came out of that unit after a week from, in terms of where they travel, where they like to bed, even though I didn't get much vocalization, going back in there a year later, you're going to come in with so much more information in terms of, where to start and potentially taking advantage of some things that you didn't take advantage of the last time. So I mean, I think that's got a ton of validity.
Oh yeah, it's huge, man. And I think it's hard because people have like I mean, I guess it's a question for you right now, Eric. Like you come out of a hunt, it sounds like in the context of like your first elk hunt, you had some success, right? Like, getting into some elk,
Yeah, I guess
learning the area. What
like
would
you
you
said,
do? Would you hunt it again or would you change?
I think I'd probably. So that's a great question. I haven't actually gone down that road in my head yet. I think now knowing that there's like you said, so there's different ways to hunt elk, right? And you don't really know which way that you think you're better at or may like a little bit better until you've gone and tried it. So the question is, would I go into this unit again? I don't know the answer to that yet. I think I would have a ton better understanding and perspective on how to e-scout now, because I think that's the other really difficult thing is if you've never gone out west, you can e-scout all you want, but until you've looked at a topo line on a map and then actually gone and walked down that drainage and know what that actually means, right? It's just a picture on a map with some skinny lines. And you're like, oh, yeah, that's a deep drainage. Well, once you actually have done it and you realize it took you an hour, to get out of that drainage, that you're like, okay, so I know what that means next time I look at it. So I don't know if I'd go back into that one, but I do know that I would for sure have a much clearer idea of what kind of unit I was looking for. And I would try to identify that the next time and then really get to know that unit year after year, even if it was an okay unit.
Yeah.
I do think that strategically is a much better way of attacking things than, kind of jumping all over the place and hoping you're going to land in a unit that has a bunch of elk and that's going to be your answer.
Yeah, for sure. Man, before we leave the e-scouting one, because I actually had some questions for you on it.
Yeah, hit me on that.
Dude, because a lot of guys spend an enormous amount of preparation e-scouting, and I don't think it's that people are fooled into believing that there's like tons and tons of value spending another hour e-scouting. I think it's what they can do. It's what they can do for their
like how much
office.
can you do before you actually get there, right?
Exactly. So it's one thing that we can do because it doesn't matter where we're at in this world, we can get on our computer and e-scout. So I think it's a really interesting topic to discuss right now because I'm sure you did some. Where did you find, what elements of e-scouting did you find practical uses, Eric, when you were in the field? And what elements of it do you realize now were just a waste of your time?
Yeah. So one of the things that I tried to do was I came up with like a 5-day plan. Hey, if this area isn't really great, where am I going to go next? So that I think that was very useful, was that I had a plan of where am I going to transition if I do this? If I go check this one area out, it's completely dead. There's nothing going on. There's no sign. What do I do next? So that was really, I think, positive because it gave me a plan going out there as opposed to just having this big area of, I'm going to go hunt this area.
Right.
And some of those spots were good. Some of those spots, now having done it, if I looked at them again, I'd probably recognize, okay, that's not even feasible because two of the areas that I kind of tagged, and I actually looked at these with guys who hunt a lot out there, were so freaking steep that it just wasn't like feasible for me to even get in there and spend a day in there because of and maybe if you were 25 or 30 but for me, and I'm in good like I trained hard and covered a lot of mileage, but they were really, really steep, really, really thick. I wasn't going to be able to cover any kind of significant ground in those two locations. And so if they weren't responding to calling, it was really just about moving, and I couldn't really move and cover any kind of significant ground due to the terrain in those. So I misread a couple of them, but the other three were all viable. And so that was a positive. I think from the standpoint of, what didn't help in terms of it is I think, like you said, you can spend tons of times just like looking at stuff and thinking, oh, that's going to be elky, or that's going to be this, or that's going to be that. And until you get out there and you're around it, you really don't know. So I think there's plenty of stuff that I looked at that I probably could have looked at once or twice and said, okay, that's an area I need to check out. That's an area I need to check out. Whereas ahead of time, I probably spent, hours like really getting super deep into an area and looking at all these little things that at the end of the day, I would have known once I got out there anyway.
Yeah, and there's really there's no way of knowing until you're there, and
there's not.
It's interesting what you said. Like you had some experienced people look at the topography, and to this day, I run into it personally. Like particularly when I was guiding horseback, I would run into it a lot because one thing that's very hard to tell on Onyx is it's very hard to tell the age of the age and the health of the vegetation. Mm-hmm. So you can have really steep, like if I was going through really steep drainages that are healthy ponderosa, easy. But if you go through, old, aged out, thick spruce that's half dead, it's impenetrable. There's no way, like you can't get through it because all the downfall. And like when you look at it on Onyx, it basically looks the same.
This section of the podcast is brought to you by Osseo Gear. With its one-of-a-kind raptor camo pattern, Osseo blends seamlessly into the whitetail woods. Its features and technology are designed specifically for the unique needs of bow hunters. I ran Osseo this past season, and from the 100-degree temperatures of the South Carolina swamps to the teens of the Illinois rut, Osseo has a system that covers you in every temperature. With 30 years of bow hunting experience, Osseo is backed by a lifetime guarantee. Use the code DONOTGO20 for 20% off the entire Osseo catalog. Find them at osseogear.com. Well, these units, and like you said, there was just deadfall everywhere. It's not just that you were like trying to move, up through a really steep area. It was like there was no place to walk. You were climbing over stuff. You were, having to walk along trees. It was just, 45 minutes to get half a mile or something like that. And it was just like you're not covering any ground and nobody's vocalizing. So you just kind of feel like you're wasting time just trying to get out of something,
Yeah.
And you're right. You can't tell that on Onyx.
No. And you're loud. You're loud in that kind of stuff.
You're sitting there going through there. Like, even if something's in here, they can hear everything I'm doing because there's no place for me to step that's not a dead tree or a dead, limb, or like there's no green anywhere to step on.
Yeah. It's exhausting. And you get halfway through it and you're like, well, I'm not even hunting now. I just need to get out of this crap.
Yeah, you feel you're exactly right. I went down, I think this was the second day I went down this really deep drainage that I had kind of identified on Onyx because it was the only way to get to a clear cut. And there was a creek at the bottom of it. And there was actually a big meadow at the bottom of this drainage. And it took forever to get down it. I got into it, and the meadow had a lot of sign in it. It was a nice looking meadow, and it was like one of the few times I actually heard something vocalized back to me. And after the third time, I realized it was a hunter on the other side of the drainage hunting that same meadow.
Sure. It happens.
Yeah, no, it happens. So it is what it is. But
Yeah. How did you feel on the hunting pressure, Eric? What was your perception of that?
so I got in there early. I was there the day before opening day, and so the first 2 days were pretty good. And then by day 3, like I literally, I kind of scouted, or not scouted, but I hunted this one piece of the unit the first day. There was absolutely nothing going on. I said, okay, I'm going to go, follow my plan. I'm going to go to this other piece on day 2. I went into that part of the unit, and that was where I actually had an encounter, and I was finding a lot of sign. And I set up camp in there. And that first day that we went in there, I think there was 2 fifth wheels that were parked right at the front of this kind of access road. And then by the next day, there was 12 people in there in this small kind of little area that we were hunting. So it got busy fast. And obviously you notice a significant difference in, I had a pretty good encounter with, it's the only bull encounter I had the whole time. I had that on the morning of day 2. And then, by the time day 3 rolled in and everybody got in there, it was nothing else happened. So,
Yeah. Do you feel like that affected you, like on the psychological side a bunch?
the pressure.
Yeah. Like seeing like you weren't into like a ton of elk, and now all of a sudden you got a bunch of people too.
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, I think I kind of expected it just because I've heard it so much. Public land, you're gonna, there's gonna be pressure, and I knew it was my first one, so I wasn't, I didn't go in with the backcountry kind of thought process of I'm gonna bomb in there 8 miles and set up camp super deep. I just didn't feel like going by myself. That was probably a great strategy from a first time guy. I didn't want to put myself, so I had a pretty mobile mentality on the first one. I could get to places, move around different parts of the unit, and just my idea was to try to, if I could move to different places and find a place that, I was seeing sign that I was, potentially having engagements, then I'd stay. If not, I'd just keep moving. And so I was prepared for the pressure part. That part didn't really freak me out that much. And to a certain extent, as a new guy, there's, I got to talk to some people and get some information. So I ran into 2 different guys who had been hunting, this part of the unit for almost 20 years. And one of the pieces of information that one of those guys gave me actually led to the one interaction I had, with a bull while I was there. So, but overall, when you start seeing bodies everywhere, it's going to make it even harder, right? Because they're going to go find different places to be. So I think it's just part of the game, if that's the way you're going to go.
Yeah, and you had the right expectation about it. There's an interesting tidbit in there, Eric, because I think the internet's an interesting place, and in a lot of ways it brings out like the negativity of whatever you're in, and not necessarily just hunting, but other stuff too. But what you said about running into other hunters, dude, that's been my experience throughout my life, like my life spent on public land. And as a guide, there's an extra layer of abrasion, right, between you and do it yourself guys. There just is, because it seems like a little more competitive environment. But still, man, 99% of my interaction with other people has been positive in the field. So it's interesting to hear that, because I almost feel like there's this, if you read about it on the internet, it's like all negative. How everybody's a moron, and
the way they make it sound.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it was different than what I expected, because no matter who you listen to or whatever, it always makes it sound like, well, if you run into somebody else, they're going to be super territorial, or they're going to be just kind of a jackass because they think you're in their way or whatever.
Right.
And that wasn't my experience. It was both of them had been hunting the unit like for quite a while. Like I said, they were older guys. Well, one of them was a guy from Iowa who'd been coming out there for 22 years, and he was in his mid 70s, so he was hunting from a tree stand. He couldn't cover ground anymore.
Yeah.
And it does, it causes a little bit of an impact, because the morning I had this, I'd called this, I was doing, like I said, a lot of calling, and I had called a bull in, but he had come in silent, and I didn't, I was kind of working this tree line in an area that had a lot of sign, and it was tons of deadfall, tons of, it was very dry. And so, I step on a twig, it snaps, and this bull's like 30 yards from me, busts out like right in front of me. I didn't even know he was
Yeah.
there. It still baffles me how these humongous animals can move like that quietly and just get in right on top of you, and you don't even know they're there.
And then when they blow out, they're loud.
Oh yeah, it was
Yeah,
like
yeah.
holy freaking! It's like
Yeah.
a freight train going out of there,
Yeah.
And he took off about another 50 yards and tucked in behind some timber and barked at me, and so it was pretty obvious that he didn't know exactly what I was, because he hung around a little bit, and I was like,
Sure.
oh well, maybe I can call him back in. So I kind of hung tight and got in somewhere and just sat still and started calling. And the wind switched on me, and this is early on, and I wasn't like, like doing my wind checker constantly. And long story short, he circled around behind me about 30 minutes later, and then busted once he winded me. And that was the only engagement I had the whole time. But to what you said, I had a bunch of my buddies were like, hey, I know a lot of guys who don't have any engagement, don't call anything in the first time. So they're like, you got to look at that as a win, which, that's hard to do in the beginning, but as you get perspective on it and I look back at it, I'm like, yeah, that was a win. Like, I learned something out of that.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And not to be like too cliche about it, Eric, but somebody said something to me. They messaged me or something. They're like, "Oh, Cliff, you're so like, it's nice of you that you congratulate all these guys on, if it's a raghorn or whatever, you're always congratulating people." And it's like, dude, I'm not like going out on a limb. It's just I have context to the fact that this public land stuff, when you kill a bull, like a legal bull elk on public land, is an insanely like huge accomplishment, man.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that a lot of people who think that like it's weird to congratulate, a guy on his like whatever his 4x4 on public land or whatever, they just don't have the context of how huge of an ordeal it is.
Oh,
you know what I mean?
I'd have freaking jumped up and down to shoot
Yeah.
for, like, I mean, I was literally like, I would have shot anything legal probably just the first time around.
Sure.
But yeah, you're right. I mean, it's obviously I only have the context of one hunt, early on in the season. I don't have the context of hunting in the rut or anything like that. But, if you're in a unit that's not a high, that doesn't have a lot of elk in it, and you've got a lot of hunters in there, just getting to the point where you actually harvest an animal is a huge win.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. It's what was your thoughts on that, Eric? Like the physical component of it, the psychological component of it, the difficulty of the hunt. Do you feel like you were prepared for it? Were there elements of it that you weren't, or what's your thoughts on that?
So I'd say from the physical part, I felt like I was pretty prepared. I had listened to a lot of people. There was a big kind of physical component to this journey for me. I had 3 different back surgeries, about 5 from 4 years ago to 7 years ago, and had a lot of health stuff, and got lucky and got connected with a really good physical therapist who took a completely different approach to my treatment and actually helped me rehab out of that stuff. Like, this was kind of my end goal when I first got to this physical therapist. I had always been super active in my life. I'd done triathlons. I played football in high school and college and CrossFit. But during the course of this whole thing with my back over 4 or 5 years, I gained like 75, 80 pounds.
Oh, okay.
And so there was a whole journey for me to like lose all that weight and prepare for this hunt. Like, this was kind of the culmination of what I wanted to achieve.
So an elk hunt was part of that. Was part of that goal.
Yeah. So like I've told this story before, but I wasn't a big game hunter, right? I coached football like up until about 3 years ago. Every fall, that's what I did. And when I stopped coaching football, in the middle of this whole thing with my back, and I'd gained a bunch of weight, I got just kind of lucky through a mutual friend. I got introduced to Bert Soren over at Sorenex, who's a big hunter. And he and I were having lunch, and he was like, "Do you hunt?" And I was like, "No, I've never really been into it." And he starts talking about it and starts showing me, hunt stand and all this stuff, and kind of it got me interested. And I was like, "Well, how do you hunt?" And he started talking about bow hunting. And there was something about it that just kind of got me interested and excited about it. And so I started doing some more homework, talked to him a little bit more, and then that just happened to match up with me meeting this physical therapist. And when I went in to see him, he said, "What do you want to be able to do? Like, what's your goal?" And I was like, "Well, right now I can hardly walk to the end of my driveway." And he's like, "Well, don't tell me what you can or can't do." He's like, "If I could get you somewhere, what would you want to be able to do?" I said,
Right.
"I want to be able to go out west and do an elk hunt." And he's like, "Well, what does that consist of?" I was like, "Anywhere from 6 to 10 miles a day with a pack, up and down a lot of steep hills and mountains." And in my head, it wasn't even feasible. And he's like, "Well, give me an hour, let me evaluate you, and we'll see." So at the end of the
Sure.
hour, he's like, "I think we can get you there,"
Yeah.
which blew my mind. Like I was kind of in this kind of dark place mentally. I had lost a lot of hope physically. I thought I was going to basically be kind of an invalid the rest of my life. And turns out I had just not been handled right clinically. So for the
Right.
last 20 months, that's been my, like, from there to this hunt. Like, that's been it. I've gotten up at 4:45 every morning, and I've trained and I've worked towards it. So physically, I was prepared for it as much as a 56-year-old guy could be doing it for the first time. And then the mental part, I'd say I had listened to a lot of your stuff, which really helped me a ton because, like, I think there's that one video on, like, top 5 reasons people fail on public land, and one of them was quitting, or the mental part, just
Yeah.
not being prepared for how hard it is mentally. I think you've got a couple of videos around that. So when I said I was hearing your voice in my head, like, as I was getting frustrated with certain things, that's what kind of kept coming back to me is, all right, how could you approach this differently? Don't keep doing the same thing. Try to pivot and take a new approach to it. And on day 6, that was probably the worst day because it was a 7-day hunt. And even though I had told myself, just getting there is the win, if you're competitive, which most of us are, once you get out there, if it's not going the way you want it to, you kind of start getting frustrated with yourself. And, I was never blaming the land or blaming the animals. I was always blaming myself. Like, what am I doing wrong? What could I be doing differently? And day 6, I was kind of like, well, maybe I'll just, that was the first day that was like, what, nothing's going to change. Like, I could just bug out of here on Sunday, and get to work early and, start, because I had to get ready for a client. And I called home and I was talking to my wife and I kind of said, I don't know, I'm thinking about maybe leaving tomorrow. And she's like, "You've been training for this for almost 2 years. She goes, "You took an entire week off. You're away from us." She's like, "You better hunt your ass off."
Yeah.
Which is exactly, I
Yeah,
needed
good
that
for
kick.
her.
I needed that kick in the pants. And so I pivoted a little bit. I set up a blind for my Saturday night sit in an area that I thought might be a high traffic area. I set that blind again on Sunday morning. I just tried, if anything, I basically was like, look, what I'm doing isn't working, so let me just try some different things. And at the end of the day, I didn't get anywhere differently, but I had a different mental approach. Like, my mentality towards it was much better that last couple days. And I hunted, Sunday, like, all day, all morning, all day. I hunted till last light. And when I got done, there was no piece of me that was like, okay, within the context of my knowledge base, I could have done anything different. I did it as hard as I could, as long as I could, till I ran out of light. And so I came out of it at least feeling like I did everything I could do within the context of my knowledge. I'm sure I made a gazillion mistakes, and as I look back at it, there are things I would do differently. But knowing what I knew at the time that I knew it, I left it out. I left it all out there, and that's all I could really ask of myself coming out of it.
Yeah, and that's huge, man. I mean, the reality is, Eric, like, the fact that you made it to the 5th or 6th day before you kind of had that, like, that moment of really wanting to, like, shuck it is pretty telling in itself, man.
Is
Because,
it usually earlier?
oh, dude, like, when hunts don't go, it's weird because as an outfitter, you see different types of hunts, right? You're in the same geography, the same type of hunting, but the thing is you see hunts that, like, a hunt that goes well from the beginning or in short order, it doesn't tell you a lot about the person. You know
Right.
what I mean?
Yeah.
And not that, like, I was in the business of judging people, but I was always found it interesting to view people,
And how people react to situations, right?
right,
Like,
and
to adversity.
right, and I would get to see a lot of these guys, like, year over year. One really nice thing about my business, Eric, is that I think probably because the price point of it, it wasn't like crazy or whatever, and also the tag availability. I had a lot of people who hunted with me every year,
Mm-hmm.
or every other year. So I got to see, how they approach this year over year. And for sure, if a guy is successful in the first 48 hours, it doesn't really, you can't, you can't garner anything about like, their mental toughness or anything. But
Yeah.
man, when you get into like day 3, 4, and it's just been like pretty, shitty conditions, low game density, that's the thing for 3, 4 days, particularly if guys have a lot going on at home and they have some potential good excuses. Like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
I've got, I should go. This is not working out right. I should go spend time with the kids, or I should go catch up on business stuff, or whatever.
Yeah.
That's when you start to see it break down. The fact that it didn't happen for you, or that thought process didn't start clicking till 5 or 6 days, means you're pretty prepared, man. Because I know you're in that realm, right? You have a lot of other stuff going on, so it's
Yeah,
hard to,
yeah. Well, I
you
just
know.
just sent my youngest daughter to college, and she's involved in athletics, and we kind of planned it around away games, so she wouldn't be, at a home game, that kind of stuff. So, and my wife was super, super supportive, even though like this is not something that I do a lot of. Right? We're
Right.
super tight. We work together. So me leaving and then also putting a little work trip on the back end. So basically being gone for like 11 days is the longest we'd ever been away from each other.
Sure.
But she was, like you said, it would have been very hard to do if it wasn't buttoned down. Like you
Yeah.
have to know when you leave, like you have to have your stuff buttoned down. You've got to have your work stuff buttoned down. Your family's got to know what the expectation is. She was great. She kind of knew, like, I'm going to let you contact me when it works for you. She wasn't constantly texting me and blowing me up, and she knew going into it, like, I know that you need to focus, and I know that if we do that stuff from home, it's going to be a distraction. It's going to pull on you. So they were all great about it. I think it would be very difficult if you didn't have that stuff dialed before you left,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
it's hard enough when nobody's pulling on you because your own mind starts to play tricks on you and your own mind starts to tell you, you could be doing this or you could be doing that. But if you actually had your wife or your kids or somebody like going, I really want you to come home, like that would make it a lot harder. I
Oh
think that
yeah.
would be super difficult.
Yeah, like that one call where she pushed you to stay.
Yeah.
If it was the inverse, it's hard. I mean, it's like
Yeah.
really
It would
hard,
have been like, yeah, you're right. You should just cut out. You're right. It's not working out. You should just, leave.
Yeah.
Then it gives you the excuse to do the stuff that your mind's starting to tell you, you're wasting time or whatever.
Yeah.
And which would have been a huge, for me, just looking back at it. And I've heard you say this on some of your stuff before. If you do that, you're gonna 4 days later, you're gonna be kicking yourself in the pants.
Oh
You're
yeah.
gonna be like, why did you do that? And I would have been. And I don't think I probably ultimately would have left, but I don't think my mindset would have been that good either the last day.
Right.
Now after she kind of gave me that kick in the butt, and I just did a complete shift in my mindset. I was like, all right, I'm going to go do something different, and if it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. But mentally, for the next day and a half, I was a ton better, and it was, I actually remember that last hunt, the last night. It was Sunday night. We had a storm roll in at like 6 or 6:30, and last night was right around 8, and it was raining, and I knew probably nothing was going to happen in the middle of the rain, but I was mentally in this place where I'm like, I'm not leaving until I have to leave,
Yeah.
right? And I just kind of pulled out a tarp and covered my head up for about 40 minutes until the rain stopped, and then I just kept calling and kept working this area until it was dark. And I was like, well, I did everything I could, but mentally I was like, I'm not leaving this place early.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting that you can. Dude, our brains are so, or our psychology is so interesting to me this way, Eric. Because I think about it all
It's
the
super
time.
interesting.
Because I feel it like even when I'm guiding. Let's say I get I'm guiding a 7-day hunt, right? And I'm into day 6, and maybe it hasn't gone all that well, and I'm starting to think about all the stuff I got to deal with at home, right? And I
Yeah.
start to get my mind like, oh, I'm ready for the airplane to come in here so I can get my stuff on it, get going. Like
Yeah.
I basically like mentally quit, even though we're like hunting through the last, that last afternoon or whatever. But I've had situations where one, you can turn it around mentally, like how you did. But the other thing is sometimes logistics will turn it around. Like I'll get a call that's like, hey, boys, like the weather's bad. Like, we're not coming to get you for 3 days. And it's weird because you'd think that in that context it would be devastating, but it actually changes your mood positive because you're like, oh, there's
It,
no, there's
there's no
no,
out. The
yeah,
excuse goes away. So
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
either going to sit here and wallow in it, or I'm going to go get after it.
yeah, exactly. Like it's like that's
Yeah.
not no that path that our brain has been like, hey, there's the exit. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's gone, and
Yeah.
all of a sudden, your whole attitude changes. Like, oh well, this is it. Like we're gonna just keep hunting, you
Yep.
know.
I was
And it,
actually a little bit just. I went from being kind of ready to leave to being upset that I didn't have more days, because
yeah,
then like after my mentality went back to, I basically almost went back to where I was on day one. I was just like, I just need some more swings of this,
sure,
but I didn't have any more. So it was like, okay, I kind of know where I'm at. But yeah, I was like, I wish I had, 10 days, or I wish I had 11 days. And the other thing that kind of kept coming back into my head too, Cliff, was, so do you know Brian Varney?
I don't.
Over at Eastman's.
I've met him. I don't know him real well.
Yeah, I don't know him, but I liked his stuff too. Like, he's kind
Sure.
of just a solid guy, at least from the stuff I've listened to. And I remember him talking about, and it was kind of a message to people like me. He's like, look, I've done this every year for the last, 30 years. And it took me 19 days, to harvest a
Yeah.
bull. I don't know if it was last year or the year before that. I remember Dan Staten, who I've had on my podcast before, last year, it took him 28 days,
Yeah.
right? And these guys are guys who do it every year, who are really good at it. And so I just kind of tried to keep that in my head too, as from a standpoint of context of like, hey, this is really hard. And guys who are really good at it, sometimes it takes them a long time. And so if you've only got 5 days or 7 days and you're not with a guide who really, really knows what they're doing, you're just, sometimes you're going to probably fail more than you're going to succeed. One of those guys that I met in the unit, who's been hunting for his entire life, is just a super, super good old boy from Kentucky.
Yeah.
He's like, he goes, my success rate's about 50%. I've been coming out here for 23 years.
Yeah.
And so he's like, don't get discouraged. He's like, just keep after it. And he's one of those guys that gave me a few tips. But I think you just have to, like you said at the very beginning, a lot of people can romanticize this. You need to be buttoned up, and mentally ready for it to be really hard and potentially not to be successful, and not have that define the hunt for you.
Yeah.
The definition of it should be the effort you put into it and what you learn coming out of it.
Yeah, no, for sure, man. And I think in my mind, to even get like more granular with it, I always use the analogy of like financial compounding, Eric. I know this is like
Yeah.
a totally dorky way to look at it.
Well, you
but,
are a Stanford guy. So.
but you like the guy you talk to in these like longer duration hunts,
Yeah.
it's not even that. It's like let's say if I went for 10 days and I'm comparing myself to the guy that went for 20 days, it's not that he had double the chances. He actually had like 10 times the chance, because each additional day you're in there, it compounds on the knowledge you've been learning the whole time.
Right. Yep.
Right. And so like, and I used to see it with my guides, man, like they would just like, they're learning the area, and then all of a sudden, like each incremental day, you're like,
Something
oh,
clicks.
yeah, they start to click because it's just all that knowledge and the, of what's going on compounds. And then it's like these guys that, spend 20 days archery hunting a year, I know local guys when I was living in Colorado that hunted for 25 days of September, these guys, like, by the time they're closing in on killing an elk, it's just a matter. They get into a mode where they have so much knowledge, they got it so teed up that it's just like sometime the next 2 days I'm gonna kill one, because it's like it's all compounded up to this like apex moment, and that's just another depth of thinking about that I think's relevant, for people to think about.
Well, I think you start to feel it, at least for me, and it's not like I was working the whole unit, right? I was working a few areas of this unit, but by the time I got to the 4th or 5th day, you really start to at least feel like, okay, I know this area, and I know where there's probably not something and where there probably is something. And then at that point, you're trying to figure out, okay, if I know that there's elk in this one specific place. Now, how do I attack that? You're not doing that on day 1 or day 2.
No.
Unless you get lucky enough to fall into it right out of the get-go. But the first few days, you're just trying to figure out where they are. And then after you figure out where they are, you're trying to figure out how do I attack it. And probably you're not right in the beginning, especially if you're not super experienced, so then you have to fail a few times before you go, okay, that's not going to work. That's not going to work. And so I was starting to feel a little bit like that by the time I got to like the night of day 6 and started getting to day 7. I was like, all right, I'm going to sit a blind, right? I'm going to try that. And I did that one time. And I heard on 2 different occasions when I was sitting that blind in the 2 travel routes that were coming in there, I heard something. But I recognized during the point of sitting that blind that that the wind just kept changing. And so I was like, okay, this is not a great strategy. Even though there's traffic around here, they're going to win me because I can't count on any kind of a consistent wind and I can't set it the right way. If I had more time, I probably would have, I know one thing I'm doing next time when I go out there, I'm bringing my saddle. Because if I get to a point where it's like I'm not getting vocalization and I just know that there's a certain area where they're going to travel or something like that, which is more of a little bit of a whitetail thought process. But if I can get a travel route and find a place with consistent wind, then I'll just hang a saddle and I'll sit it for a few days and I'll count on them eventually coming by if I've got the right wind. I just kind of got to that point too late in the hunt, and I didn't have that gear that I needed. But that's a big thing that I learned coming out of it is next time I'll bring a saddle.
Yep. And you'll immediately be more effective. I think the other thing, Eric, is I know we chatted a little bit about it, is all this build up part of it, it's lost in the Instagram world and everything else. I think it's useful for people who are new to elk hunting to realize that a lot of these guys that they just pop up 2 days into September with dead bulls. a lot of them are going in with tons of prior knowledge if they're if they're doing this type of hunt that we're talking about. But another huge chunk of them, and this is not derogatory towards them ever, I think it's just some context that people should have. They're being dropped into areas where they're immediately into elk density.
Right.
I'm going to go guide here in a couple days, and the first day I will call in a bull. It has nothing to do with my skill set. It has the fact that I'm going to drop into a drainage that I know there's elk rutting right off the bat.
Mm-hmm.
That's 99% of your hunt takes place before that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I think it's good for people to realize that that's what this type of hunting is about. The type of hunt that you did, that's a huge part of it, man. Just that whole build up part.
No, I mean, so I've got buddies that live out in Montana, live in some areas that have pretty good elk density. And they're scouting, just like we scout whitetail out here, they're scouting elk all year round. So when elk season comes around, it's not they're not like me who's getting dropped into a unit that they've never been in before and are trying to figure out that unit. They know where there's elk right out of the gate, and they know where they're going to hunt, and they know in a lot of cases they're hunting a specific bull, right? And those guys are popping up on Instagram just like everybody else, with this big bull, and it looks great. And doesn't mean they're not a great hunter. They are a great hunter. That's part of the reason why they kill so early is because their scouting is so good. But it's just a completely different scenario than, a guy who's going to go do a public land elk hunt who doesn't live there, hasn't scouted there, doesn't know the area, and you've got 7 days to try to make it happen with no prior knowledge of anything other than onyx.
Right. Yeah. No, for sure. But it doesn't mean it's a bad thing because all that stuff's fun, man.
You just got to be okay with the process, right? And not have it be, which that's difficult for a lot of people. I think a lot of us that do this probably are people who are, success driven and success oriented, and you have to do a better job of defining what success is, and that was part of my, part of my internal correction throughout the course of this was I went into it with this idea of success for me is just going out there, being able to do it physically and learning. And then by the time I got to day 3, 4, I kind of had lost sight of that, and I was really getting frustrated because I wasn't getting onto anything. And that's where I had to kind of correct my mind, was okay, if you come out of this and you don't harvest an animal, how are you going to make sure that you still come out of it feeling like you had a successful hunt? Because if you came out here and spent 7 days out here in this amazing country, and got to learn a ton and experience all this and don't come out of this feeling like it was a good experience, then mentally you did something wrong. And that's where I had
Right.
to change kind of my approach to things in the middle of it.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And it's not like a lot of people I think view this discussion, Eric, is like, oh, Eric threw in the towel. That's not like, because I do think that's negative. Like, you don't just want to give up. Be like,
Yeah, if
it
I
was
would have
like,
quit on day 6, I would have been pissed at myself. I
yeah,
agree
yeah,
with that.
that's
That would have been
different.
given up.
But continuing to like climb the ladder, be like, oh, like I got this I got this figured out a whole lot better. Tomorrow it's gonna improve my chances even better of figuring this out. That's just the reality of the deal, you know.
Yeah, and I look at it a lot like, I think just because I've coached for so long and I was an athlete for so long, I look at the mental part of it just like the mental part of a game or a season. There's at no point in football do you, the entire time you're on a team, sit there and think we're the best team there is and we're going to win every game. There's always doubt that creeps into your head. There's always, oh, this team we're playing is better than us, and do I think I can beat them at the beginning of the week? And then if you prepare the right way and work your way through the week, by the time you get to the game, you've gotten yourself to the point where you believe, hey, if I execute all these things I'm supposed to execute, I've got a pretty good chance of winning. That, to me, this is no different. If you're one of these people who lies to yourself, or at least is lying on social media and saying, oh, I never doubt anything, and my mind is never, I know the minute I step foot on there, I'm gonna, I'm gonna harvest. And if you're somebody who doubts anything, then you're mentally weak. That's not how we work. That's not how, as humans, our brains work. And I just don't think you're being honest when you're saying that. So I think recognizing that that's part of the process, which I think you do a real service to the people that you talk to through your social media channels. And, I know you said you kind of border on this thing of sometimes feeling like you're being too negative. I don't think you do that. I think that you're being honest with people. And I think that you're giving them information that's really important for them to have, so that they can have a real context of what it's going to be like if you go out and try to do something like this, and that there are ups and downs mentally that you have to be prepared for. And if you aren't prepared for those things, I think they're going to catch you by surprise. I was
Sure.
prepared for it, and even though it was difficult, I figured out a way to work through it. And like I said, it was only one day. I was good day 1 through 5. I kind of had a period of a few hours in there in the middle of the day where I was like, maybe this is kind of stupid to keep doing. But then, through a good support system and me kind of getting my mind right, I flipped that switch pretty quick. So, but I think it would have been more difficult to do if I hadn't been ready for it. Like, the fact that I knew that was coming made it an easier way to process for me.
Right. No, totally, man. Eric, do you got another 10, 15 minutes?
Yeah. Yeah.
Let me I think we've covered a bunch of super useful stuff, but I've got like some quick fire questions.
Yeah.
that I
Let's
think
roll.
would be,
That'd
that I
be
think
great.
people would like. But the first one I want to start with, and because you hinted at it, and you've probably touched on some of them, but are there any things that in your mind, like tactics wise, that you for sure would do different that on your next hunt?
Yeah, so just with my knowledge, right? And again, I have to approach this from the standpoint of somebody who hasn't hunted elk for 20 years, because if you've done this for a long time, you may listen to this answer and go, well, I wouldn't do that. And so
Yeah.
I would take, so I like to hunt from a saddle out east, but I would take some kind of a mobile tree setup with me, so that if I got into a situation like this, I would earlier go to something like that. I would find an area that was a pretty high traffic area that had fresh sign, that I felt like if I parked there for a couple days, I would have a pretty high opportunity for success, and I would get something with a place that has pretty consistent wind, and I would get up in a tree, and I would probably just try to play the odds on it, as opposed to continuing just to travel a bunch of ground with absolutely no response.
Right. And my thought on that sort of thing, Eric, is because I don't know a lot of people who saddle hunt in Colorado. I don't even know that many guys that hunt at tree stands, but there are people that do. But my feeling is that it probably work pretty well. And I have noticed over the years, I've run into several individuals that developed really odd tactics that are not odd, but from my like the context of just always hunting Colorado, the West weren't
Yeah.
like the norm. That they figured out like a unique way to hunt stuff, and it worked. Like I vividly remember one of my most successful rifle hunters, and he hunted with me every year. Before I started outfitting, he had hunted in these camps like for 20 years before me. And what he did, Eric, during rifle season, he would go into an area like a meadow where there was elk, like some elk tracks, but he was
Yeah.
always hunting late season in the snow. And he would go out in the middle where there's like a little bunch of trees, and he'd dig a little blind in the snow, and then he'd go over to the elk tracks, and he would shimmy on the elk tracks through like the knee-high snow. He would shimmy on the elk tracks and make like a pathway that was like, you know, right like 80 yards from his blind. He was rifle hunting. And so he would just like make this deep trench in the snow with his legs.
Yeah.
And then he'd go over to another set of elk tracks that were on the side of the timber, and he'd bring that in too and make this like this artificial path.
A travel path for him.
Yeah, for the elk. And
yeah,
then he
just
would
to create a corridor.
yeah, and then he would sit in the blind, and he had a little rear view mirror, like an old, you know, F-250 rear view mirror that he would hang in front of the blind.
That's
where
great.
He could see the trails there, and he would sit there with a book, and he'd kill one every year. And they were easy to pack out because they'd be right in the middle of one of those meadows.
Yeah.
So I just roll up with the horses and pack them out.
Well,
So-
the guy that I met from Iowa, Cliff, was who was in his 70s, has been sitting tree stands for the last 15 years in there, and
Yeah.
he's harvested, I think he told me, 12 bulls from a tree stand
yeah,
in the last 15 years, and so he just knows where to set up. And so, you know, I don't know that I think a lot of people like, well, they hunt tree stands all the time, or they're like, hey, I'm going out west for the experience. I want to, you know, cover 10 miles a day or whatever. I want to call. And I think I would want to do that too. I'm just saying, as opposed to doing that for 7 days with no luck, if you get out there, you need a plan B, and plan B isn't always potentially going to a completely different place, because I was in an area that I knew there were elk in there, even though it wasn't maybe a high density area. I just couldn't figure out how to get to them. And I think if that happened to me again, as opposed to just continuing to push all over the place, especially when there's pressure from other hunters, find the place where you know they're going to travel through, or there's a high percentage of time they're going to travel through there, and figure out how to set up shop in there in a way that's different, and then just wait on it. Like, I think it's a tactic that we use out east a lot, and will definitely bring a setup so that I'm able to do that next time if I need to.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good one, man. And I think also inside what you just said, Eric, my personal opinion is like the type of units, the stuff that you can get tags for and that sort of thing in Colorado, if you're into elk, you shouldn't move.
Yeah.
Just statistically, if you're into them, even if it's not ideal, you shouldn't move.
Yeah, and I wrestled with that one a little bit too, Cliff. I think I got into them in that part of the unit in day 2. I hunted it for 3 more days without any luck. And on day 6, I did go check out a couple of other areas that ended up they were too steep to traverse. Like you said, they were too nasty. And on day 7, I went back to that one area again, because that's kind of what I always had in my head is like, don't leave elk to find elk, even though it was pressured. I just would have had a different way to go about doing it next time. So I'll be better prepared the next time I go out. I'll have something like that in my kit.
Gotcha. No, that'll be interesting, man. I think it's a good approach. What about, here's one for you, best gear that you found very useful, any gear that you found you didn't use or just didn't work out for you?
I'd say gear that I found useful was, just being prepared with a good layer system. Even when I had a couple of mornings where it was like 33 degrees, and I really only ran like, my base layer was like a really thin hoodie, like a Kuiu Tiburon hoodie, and then I wore like something like this, like a thin merino over the top of it. And that's really the only thing I needed, other than I did pack something that was like, I don't know what Sitka's version of it, but for Kuiu, it's like their guide jacket. Because when I sat that blind a couple times, it was like in the 30s in the morning, and so I had 3 different layers on. So having a good layering system was a really big deal. I had done a lot of research on it, and that came in handy because I was constantly adding and shedding layers depending on my activity level and what I was doing. What I brought that I didn't use as much, which is, I know this is antithetical to what everyone says, but I brought like way too much food.
Okay.
Um, I just, those Peaks meals are, if you eat the whole thing, it's like 1,200 calories.
Yeah.
And I don't eat breakfast at home. Like I drink coffee and I hydrate a lot. And I thought I would eat breakfast out there just because I was, moving a lot, but I still didn't, like I had to actually kind of make myself eat. So I had too much food. I would probably bring a little bit less food, or at least have a different way of carrying it than always having it, you know, I would take less out in the field with me, and then I would just kind of go from there and plan on it. One of the things that I will say is really, really important is, and I'm not a person who cramps, but the first 2 nights I was there, like the first night I woke up in the middle of the night and I had this huge cramp in my adductor. And, if you're not somebody who, like, if you're a flatlander like me who trains and works out all the time, but you're not used to side hilling and climbing a bunch of mountains, you're using completely different muscles than you would normally use. And I had packed, I think it was the Mountain Ops hydrate stuff that you mix in with your water,
Yeah.
to increase the amount of electrolytes you're getting. And I hadn't put it in my water the first day and morning I was there. And I was cramping like crazy at night, not while I was training, but at night. And so I really made, like, starting, I think it was on day 2 in the afternoon, I started putting that in my water jug all the time. Like, I just didn't ever have water that didn't have electrolytes in it. And that helped a ton. Like, my cramp stuff went away. I think I worked through part of it, but just really, when you don't sweat a ton, which you don't sweat out there, I'm from South Carolina where you sweat when you walk outside.
Right.
And sweating makes you drink. Well, when it's dry, you don't sweat that much. And so you have to, make yourself drink. So I made myself as soon as I woke up every morning, I made myself drink 30 ounces of water with electrolytes in it. And then I kept electrolytes in my water all the time. So I would say make sure that you have a box or a packet or something that has about 20 or 25 packets of electrolytes, and just keep it in your water. That was honestly probably one of the biggest things that I brought. I did overpack on clothes, even though I brought a good layering system. I brought like a regular jacket, and I brought a puffy jacket. I brought 2 t-shirts or 3 t-shirts, and I really only ever used one. So I'd say probably from a gear perspective, I probably brought too many clothes. I'll pill back on that. I've heard this one in a lot of videos before, but this one saved me is leukotape.
Yeah.
Making sure you have a pack or some kind of way to access leukotape. I had boots that I had worn and broken in and everything, but you can't simulate the kind of movement you're going to have unless you live out there. And I don't have mountains, and I don't have places to side hill. And so what I found in the first couple of days was the movements I was making were completely different than the way I had trained here. And I was rubbing different parts of my feet. The boots were just rubbing different parts of my feet, even though they were broken in. And so I had leukotape in like 4 different places on my feet, and it saved me like crazy from getting blisters. So that's one that I would make sure I have in my pack. And then I think just probably the other one is, in terms of gear that I think was really important, it's just making sure you've got a good pack that's comfortable. Like I messed around with my pack a ton before I got out here. I've got an Exo Mountain Gear pack, and for one reason or another, I just couldn't get comfortable with it before I came out here. And to their credit, they actually custom made me a different lumbar support because of the thing I was having with my back. And that made like all the difference in the world, because I was actually planning on buying a different one before I came out.
What was the exact issue, Eric, on your back?
It was sliding. It was sliding down, and I was training with, because if I had 20 or 30 pounds in it, it was no big deal. But like as I got closer to the hunt, I was doing some 5 to 6 mile rucks with like 60 to 70 pounds just to simulate in case I had to, because I wanted to make sure that if I did have to pack out meat, that like I knew it was going to work for me.
Sure.
And when I put weight in it, it was sliding too much. And I thought I was kind of, I had called them and talked to them multiple times. I felt pretty good about how I was doing the load lifters and how I was setting up my straps. And I was, they were having me send videos back into them, and they were like, "Yeah, you're doing everything right. It may just be a situation where I've got a little bit of a spinal stenosis thing at the bottom of my back. That's part of my back problem." And they were just like, you just need a bigger lumbar support. And so to their credit, like Mark and Steve and Jake over there at Exo, like they literally custom made me a lumbar support that was like twice as thick as the other ones that come with it,
Okay.
and it like completely changed the way the pack fit.
Nice. And I've only heard good things from those guys. Like years ago, I was on their podcast and I enjoyed talking to them, but I don't have a lot of interaction with them. But man, out of like I have a Kafaru pack and I'm a fan of Kafaru packs,
Yeah.
but I've never heard anybody that has an Exo mountain pack complain about it. Or if they had something, those guys fixed it for them or whatever.
Yeah, I
So
think that's probably the biggest thing is their customer service stuff was really, really good. Because I was actually going to try a Kafaru pack after I couldn't, like when I thought, all right, I'm not going to be able to make this work. I was like, that's kind of what all my buddies run. And
sure.
I bought this one like a year and a half ago before I really got to know anybody out there. And so I was like, all right, well, maybe I'll just need to get a different pack. But to their credit, like they really worked with me to make it work. And by
Sure.
the time I got out there, it was great. I covered a lot of miles with it, and and I think too that like you do a really good job of this, but I've talked to some other people. I think this is probably one of the other mistakes that people would typically make is getting too heavy in their pack, like really putting thought into how you pack it, what's in it, what you're carrying on a daily basis versus what you leave in the tent, like what you have to have with you. I
Right.
think there's this tendency for guys like me to probably have too much stuff in there. And so I got it to the point where, if I went out with a full loadout, it was around 34 pounds. And that was like if I had a few days worth of food in there, like if I thought, all right, I may not come back tonight.
Yeah.
But if it was like I knew I was coming back, then I had it down to like around 18 pounds. And I
Yeah.
think that's a mistake that a lot of people make is going too heavy with the stuff they've got in their pack, depending on what they're planning on doing that day.
Yeah, and it's even like if you're hiking a bunch, man, the difference, I think people are always thinking about like, oh, I'll worry about weight when I get into 40, 50, 60 pounds.
Yeah.
But dude, the difference between carrying a 15-pound pack and a 30-pound pack
Huge.
is, yeah, gigantic,
Gigantic.
you know? And I think that's where people, like some guys will carry a 30-pound day pack all the time, and you look through and you're like, dude, why do you have a roll of garbage bags in your day pack? You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Just like stuff like that. It's like,
Well, I was doing that throughout the course of the hunt because I like even
yeah,
like in the first couple of days, I think I had it at like around 30, 32 pounds. And it felt like nothing when I'd put it on in the morning, and then you'd take it off at 11 or 12 to take a break for, an hour and put it back on. And you're like, holy shit, this thing is freaking heavy,
yeah,
And so every day I was kind of looking at it going, what can I peel out today?
this stuff. Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure, for sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, Eric, this has been awesome, man. I think there's tons of useful stuff in here. Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about, or we kind of cover it?
Yeah, no, it's been great. That's kind of really what I just had, I've got so much useful information from people like you, in trying to prepare for this. But I think the one thing I would say, if you're getting ready to go and you've never done it before, is just get a plan that works for you, right? You can second guess yourself over and over and over because everyone's got a different concept of what you should do or how you should do it. But at the end of the day, you have to feel good about what you're packing, what you're taking, cover your bases. But if I was going to sell somebody overpack versus underpack, I'd say underpack. Just make sure you've got enough stuff to stay warm. The rest of the stuff you can work around.
Right.
And then, from the standpoint of how you're going to do your hunt, just get, you're not going to know if you've never done it before, what is your style. And so you kind of have to, my thought process around mine was because I'm not a backcountry guy. That's not something I've done before. Like I would be very comfortable doing that with a guide, but I knew going into it, if it's my first time and I don't have somebody going with me, that I was much more comfortable just mentally going in knowing I'm going to be mobile. I'm going to be able to kind of base out of a place. If it doesn't work for me in that day, I'll pull up stakes and I'll go somewhere else. But it gave me a lot more confidence knowing that I wasn't going to get stuck in one place.
Yeah.
Just the first time around because I knew, okay, I might go to something different and that might feel more comfortable to me. So for me, I just felt like once you get mentally comfortable with your plan, you're going to be a lot more comfortable in general just going out and taking on something that you don't know. And I think probably to me that's one of the biggest pieces of advice is just get a plan that you feel good about,
Yeah.
and then have a at least 3 or 4 different options to your plan so you don't get stuck in one place that's not working for you and feel like you don't know where to go or what to do with it.
Yeah. And dude, I think I would just reiterate that, Eric. And I guess what I would add to it is I think people tend to get one tracked mind sometimes depending on like who they're following. Maybe you're
Yeah.
following me and I have a certain type of hunting that I've done and that, that I'm going to tend to like tilt people towards. And then if you follow Cam Haynes, you might have a different one. You follow, you might have a different like path that you view as to success.
Mm-hmm.
And the only thing I would add, man, is that elk get killed in all sorts of goofy ways all over Colorado every year. There's guys killing them 200 yards from a highway. There's guys killing them 10 miles into the back of a basin in like the nastiest part of the, Maroon Bells or the San Juans, right? Like drastically different ways to kill elk. And to this day, honestly, Eric, I don't know statistically what's the highest success for like a new hunter. Do the guys that go backpack hard, do they have a higher success than the guy who was partially mobile like you? I can almost tell you with certainty they don't. When you account for everything that goes in, I think it's like pretty much the same. So so for better or worse, the style doesn't actually equate to like a big difference in harvest success, I guess is what I would add.
Yeah, I felt that was probably true because in the beginning I was, my whole mindset was, because this is what everyone talks about, right? This is what's sexy right now is going deep. And in the beginning, when I started thinking about hunting out there, I just almost automatically assumed that's what I would be doing. Mm-hmm. And then the more I talked to people that live out there and that do it on a regular basis, there were some of them that's what they do, but there's a lot of them that are like, you got to have options, because if you go deep and for some reason or another, there's not elk there, you've made a multi-day commitment that now you have to get yourself back out of. So if you don't, if you know the country and there's elk there, then it makes sense to go deep. But if you don't know the country, it makes more sense to give yourself options so that if you hit one spot and it's just not a good spot, you can get somewhere else without killing multiple days before you do it. And so for me, I just felt like that was the best way to plan, because I don't know the area. I don't live out there. I didn't have time to scout. So I wanted to give myself multiple options so that, I didn't just take one swing at it and that was the only one. And then the second part that you just said, which I think is true, there's probably a lot of people listening to this that would be like, why would you take a saddle out there with you? You're going out west. The whole purpose of going out west is to like cover ground and do this and hunt elk a certain way. And I think that kind of comes back to that whole romanticizing the whole thing, which I was there too. It's easy to do that. But when you're on day 4 or day 5 and you've done the exact same thing and they're not talking and you're not really getting into them, for me, I'd much rather pivot and try a different strategy. And then if I harvest, I'm not going to sit there and, be beating myself up because I didn't walk another 20 miles if I had to hang a saddle and I killed a bull. You know what I'm saying? Like at the end of the day, I think you gotta hunt the way that. And I, like I said, I met that guy out there who'd been hunting out there for 20 years, and he's killed 12 bulls out of a tree since he got older. And I don't think I would fly all the way out there and hang a tree stand on day 1 like he did, but I would definitely have it as a backup plan.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. And in the end, the purpose is to interact with elk and kill one.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
That's right.
It's not to live some other, to recreate somebody's YouTube video or whatever,
I think there's a lot of that, though. Like you said, people see a lot of this stuff, and they kind of, like, depending on who they follow, they kind of develop this thought process of, like, that's how I want to be. And until you get out there and do it, you'll develop who you want to be when you get out there. I would just say make sure you've got options so that because all of us that are coming out from the East Coast, there's very few of us that are going to be like, oh, yeah, I can go take a week and go scout that unit in July. Give yourself a lot of different options so that when you do get out there, you don't just lock yourself into one way of doing something. You got to be able to pivot.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a great thought to end it on, Eric. Dude, I appreciate it, man. This is going to be super helpful to guys.
Yeah, I appreciate you being able to do this too, because it's, for me, like I said, I listened to a ton of this stuff getting ready to go out, and if you can, hopefully, if somebody can learn one thing and it helps them be successful, then it's worth doing. And I appreciate you taking the time and visiting with me too. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course, man. Thanks, dude.
All right, brother. Appreciate it. If you enjoy this, please subscribe to my channel. I am on Apple Podcasts. I am on Spotify, both audio and video. It's also on YouTube and Rumble. This section of the podcast is brought to you by Ridgeline Athlete. Don't let your physical preparation hold you back from finding success this season. You can train anytime, anywhere with a professional coach who brings decades of performance training and hunting experience to every session, and I think that is important. Ridgeline Athlete provides backcountry athletes with safe, highly effective training programs that are built for the demands of the backcountry. Use RA Do Not Go 30 to get 30% off any training program. You can find them at ridgelineathlete.com or hit up Adrian on Instagram at ridgelineathlete.